She scrubbed marble floors for a monster the whole city feared. One nap, one unguarded moment. Her daughter crawled straight into the lion's den, onto the chest of a sleeping Mafia king. Zuri froze, certain she'd lose everything. Her job, her daughter's safety, maybe her life. But when his eyes opened, something in Kang Min-ho's cold heart cracked wide open. He didn't punish her. He claimed her. And nothing in his empire would ever be the same again. If your heart is already racing, don't scroll past this one. Hit subscribe before you get lost in the story, because this channel lives for moments exactly like this one. Drop a comment right now with the word claimed if you already know she's in trouble, the good kind. Share this with someone who still believes in slow burn love that could burn a whole empire down. And if you want to know how far a dangerous man will go to protect a woman he was never supposed to want, stay until the very end, because this story does not let go easily. The Kang estate sat behind iron gates on a hill overlooking Seoul, a fortress dressed as a mansion. Inside, 30 staff moved like ghosts, trained never to be seen, never to be heard, never to be remembered. Zuri had worked there for 8 months, ever since fleeing a life she refused to speak of. She kept her head down, her daughter Amara hidden in the staff quarters, and her hands busy. Rule number 1, whispered to her on her first day, never let Kang Min-ho notice you exist. Min-ho ran half of Seoul's underworld from behind a desk of black glass, and the other half feared him without ever meeting him. Rivals called him ruthless. His own men called him untouchable. No one called him kind. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night in years, haunted by a war he'd fought to keep his family's name alive. That afternoon, exhaustion finally won, and he collapsed onto the study's leather couch, dead to the world for the first time in months. Later that afternoon, Zuri tucked 6-month-old Amara into a portable bassinet in the small linen closet beside the study, the only place quiet enough for a nap while she finished her rounds. She turned her back for 90 seconds to fold towels, and when she turned around, the bassinet was empty. Her stomach dropped through the floor. She followed the sound of tiny gurgling laughter through the cracked study door, and her blood turned to ice. Amara was draped across the chest of Kang Min-ho, tiny fists gripping the collar of his black shirt, drooling happily onto silk. Zuri's hands flew to her mouth. If he woke and found a maid's child on his body, in his private study, she would not just lose her job. She might disappear the way people whispered other maids had disappeared before her. She stepped forward on trembling legs to snatch her daughter back before disaster struck. She was 3 steps from the couch when his eyes opened. Not slowly, not groggily. All at once, the way a soldier wakes, alert, dangerous, already calculating threat. Zuri's whole body locked in place. She braced for his voice to crack like a whip, for the fury she'd heard described in hushed kitchen gossip. Instead, Min-ho looked down at the small warm weight on his chest, then up at the terrified woman standing frozen in his study, and something unreadable moved behind his dark eyes. "She's yours," he said. Not a question. "I'm so sorry, sir. She must have crawled. I only turned around for a moment. Please, I'll take her. It will never happen again, I swear it." Zuri's words tumbled out in a panicked rush, her hands shaking as she reached for her daughter. Min-ho didn't move to hand the baby over. He watched Zuri instead, the way her whole body trembled not from cold but from fear of him, and something in his chest, something long dead, twisted uncomfortably. "Sit down," he said quietly. Zuri's legs nearly gave out. Sit down was what men like him said before they destroyed someone. She lowered herself into the chair across from him, arms aching to hold her daughter, eyes fixed on the floor. Amara, oblivious to the danger her mother felt, patted Min-ho's jaw with a chubby hand and giggled. To Zuri's shock, the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close enough to one that she'd never seen grace his face in 8 months of watching him from a distance. "What's her name?" he asked. "Amara, sir." "And yours?" "Zuri." He said nothing else for a long moment, simply looking at the small life gripping his shirt like it belonged there. Then he lifted Amara carefully, the way a man handles something he's afraid of breaking, and passed her back into her mother's arms. "You're not being punished," he said.
Go.
Before I change my mind about how strange this afternoon was. That evening, the staff quarters buzzed with disbelief. No one survived a mistake like that unscathed, not with Kang Min-ho. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Yoon, pulled Zuri aside with wide eyes. "He let you walk away?" He didn't even raise his voice. Zuri could only shake her head, still stunned herself, Amara asleep against her shoulder. She didn't understand it either. Men like him weren't supposed to soften. Yet something in the way he'd looked at her daughter had felt less like danger and more like a door quietly opening. She told herself it meant nothing. He was simply too tired to be cruel that day, that was all. She could not afford to read anything else into it, not with a daughter to protect and a past she'd buried deep enough to survive on. But long after Amara had fallen asleep, Zuri lay awake replaying the almost smile on a Mafia boss's face and hating herself a little for how much she wanted to see it again. The following morning, Min-ho found himself standing in the kitchen doorway at 6 a.m., an hour he was never awake for meals, watching a maid feed her daughter mashed banana at the small staff table. He told himself he'd come down for coffee. He stayed for 11 minutes, saying nothing, simply observing the soft chaos of Amara smearing food across her mother's sleeve and Zuri laughing quietly despite her exhaustion. When Zuri noticed him standing there, she startled, nearly dropping the spoon. "Sir, I'm sorry. We'll move to the staff room." "Stay," he said, and left without another word, leaving Zuri staring after him, heart pounding for reasons she refused to name. By the end of the week, small things had begun changing without explanation. A crib appeared in the staff quarters, expensive, imported, far beyond anything a maid could afford, with no note attached. Extra formula and diapers arrived in the kitchen pantry, never billed to anyone's wages. Zuri asked Mrs. Yoon who had ordered them. The housekeeper only shrugged, though her eyes flicked meaningfully toward the east wing where Min-ho's office sat. Zuri knew, with a sinking, fluttering certainty, exactly who was responsible, though she could never prove it, and he would never admit it. She found him in the hallway that afternoon and tried to thank him. He cut her off before she finished the first sentence. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, already walking away, though the ghost of that almost smile touched his mouth again. Zuri stood there long after he disappeared around the corner, hand pressed to her chest, wondering how a man so feared could make her feel so unexpectedly safe. A few days later, Min-ho's business partner, Seo Tae-yong, visited the estate for a meeting and lingered afterward in the garden, where he found Zuri hanging laundry. Tae-yong was smooth where Min-ho was sharp, charming where Min-ho was silent, and he flirted openly, complimenting her smile, asking why a woman like her was wasted folding sheets. Zuri, flustered and polite, tried to deflect without offending a guest of the house. She didn't notice the study window above them had opened, or the man standing behind it with his jaw tightening like a fist. By the time Tae-yong left that evening, Min-ho had already made 2 calls ensuring the man would never again be granted access to the estate without an armed escort watching his every step. When Zuri mentioned, hesitantly, that Mr. Seo seemed nice, Min-ho's voice went cold in a way she'd never heard directed at her. "He isn't allowed near you again." He didn't explain further, and stormed off before she could ask why a Mafia boss cared who complimented his maid. That night, Zuri lay awake dissecting his reaction from every angle, refusing to let herself hope it meant what her heart insisted it meant. Men like Kang Min-ho did not fall for maids. Men like him married daughters of rival empires for alliance, not affection, and used women like Zuri only until they grew bored. She had learned that lesson once already, at a devastating cost that had sent her running from her old life with nothing but a suitcase and a baby in her arms. She would not make that mistake twice, no matter how gently he'd handled her daughter, no matter how his eyes lingered a beat too long whenever she entered a room. But hope, once planted, is a stubborn thing. It grew anyway, quietly, in the space between his rare almost smiles and the crib he pretended he hadn't bought. 2 weeks later, Amara caught a fever in the middle of the night, burning hot and inconsolable, and Zuri's panic spiraled fast. She had no car, no money for a private clinic, and the nearest hospital was 30 minutes away, by foot in the rain. She was halfway to knocking on Mrs. Yoon's door for help when she nearly collided with Min-ho in the hallway, still dressed from a late business call, dark circles under his eyes. One look at Zuri's tear-streaked face and Amara's flushed cheeks, and he didn't ask questions. He simply took the baby from her arms and moved. Within 4 minutes, his private driver had the car running. Within 20, Amara was being examined by the best pediatrician in Seoul, pulled from bed by a single phone call that clearly could not be refused. Zuri sat in the sterile waiting room, hands shaking, and Min-ho sat beside her, closer than propriety allowed, his silence somehow louder and more comforting than any words could have been. When the doctor finally emerged to say it was only a minor infection, easily treated, Zuri broke down crying from relief, and Min-ho, without thinking, without permission, pulled her against his chest and let her. In the days that followed, something between them shifted permanently, though neither said it aloud. Min-ho found reasons to be near the kitchen at odd hours. Zuri found herself smiling before she remembered to stop. The staff noticed, whispering behind hands, careful never to let Min-ho catch them speculating about a man everyone believed incapable of tenderness. Only Mrs. Yoon dared say anything directly, cornering Zuri in the pantry one evening. "Be careful, child," the older woman warned, not unkindly. "Men like him don't fall halfway. When they fall like buildings, and they take everyone underneath down with them." Zuri wanted to argue, to insist there was nothing between them worth warning her about, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down she already knew Mrs. Yoon was right, and it terrified her exactly how much she no longer cared. One rainy evening, a car backfired on the street beyond the estate walls, or so it sounded, until the front gate security alarm shrieked to life and Min-ho's men scrambled, with weapons drawn. A rival syndicate, the Beck family, had grown tired of losing territory to Min-ho's expanding empire and sent a message the only way men like them knew how. Gunfire aimed at the front gate, meant to terrify rather than kill, a warning shot across enemy lines. Chaos erupted through the estate. Zuri grabbed Amara and ran for the safest interior room, heart hammering against her ribs. Min-ho found her there minutes later, barricaded in a closet with her daughter pressed to her chest, both of them shaking. He didn't say a word. He simply wrapped both of them in his arms, shielding them with his own body between Zuri and the door, and stayed there until his men confirmed the estate was secure. In the aftermath, adrenaline still coursing hot through both their veins, Zuri looked up at him and saw not a monster the city feared, but a man who had just risked his life without a second's hesitation to protect a maid and her child. "You could have died," she whispered, voice breaking. "I would rather die than let anything happen to either of you," he said, and the words landed like a confession neither of them had been ready for. Zuri's breath caught. The rain hammered against the windows outside, the danger only just beginning to fade from the air, and something electric crackled between them in its place. Months of restraint finally buckling under the weight of fear and relief, and longing too large to keep contained any longer. Neither of them moved away. His hand rose to brush a strand of wet hair from her face, fingers lingering against her cheek longer than necessary. Zuri's pulse thundered in her ears. She should step back. She should remember every reason this was reckless, impossible, dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with gunfire. Instead, she leaned into his palm, and Min-ho exhaled like a man finally allowed to breathe after years underwater. Amara, safely tucked between them, had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder, oblivious to the storm quietly rewriting both their lives. Zuri, he murmured, her name sounding foreign and precious in his mouth. I have spent my whole life being feared. I don't know how to be anything else. But I do not want to be feared by you. You're not, she whispered back, and it was the truest thing she'd said in 8 months. What happened between them next was never spoken of by either of them afterward. Only felt, only carried quietly in stolen glances and a warmth that lingered long after the danger had passed, and Amara had been laid gently in her crib. There was tenderness in the dark that night, an emotional collision of two people who had spent too long guarding themselves against exactly this kind of surrender. There was breathlessness and closeness, and the particular vulnerability of two broken people finally choosing to be honest with each other, if only for a few stolen hours before the sun rose and reality returned. When morning light finally crept through the curtains, Zuri was gone from the room, and dread had already replaced everything she'd felt the night before. The next morning, Zuri packed a small bag with shaking hands, Amara balanced on her hip, convinced that what had happened had ruined everything. Men like Minho didn't fall in love with maids. They used them and discarded them once the danger passed and clarity returned. She could not bear to see indifference in his eyes after what she'd given him, could not survive being looked at like a mistake he regretted. Better to leave with her heart cracked than stay and watch him break it slowly, piece by piece, the way she'd been broken once before. She left a note with Mrs. Yoon and slipped out the service entrance before dawn, catching the first bus toward a cousin's apartment across the city, telling herself it was the only sensible choice left to her. Minho woke to an empty bed and a silence in the house that felt different from any silence he'd known before, hollow, wrong, unbearable. When Mrs. Yoon handed him the note with trembling hands, his expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went dark and dangerous in a way that made even his most loyal men take a step back. He didn't shout. He didn't break anything. He simply said, "Find her," in a voice quiet enough to make the whole house go still, and every man in his employ understood that failure was not an option they'd be permitted to survive. By that afternoon, his network had already traced the bus route, the cousin's address, the general district where Zuri had vanished to. Minho arrived alone, dismissing his usual security detail because whatever this was, it needed to be him and only him standing at that door. He knocked. Zuri opened it, and the sight of him standing there in the doorway of a cramped apartment, dressed down, hair slightly disheveled from the drive, stole every rehearsed argument right out of her mind. "You shouldn't have come," she said, voice trembling. "I shouldn't have let you leave," he answered. "I know what men like you do with women like me," Zuri said, arms crossed tight over her chest, protecting a heart already cracking wide open. "You take what you want in the dark and forget it by morning." "I can't. I won't let Amara grow up watching me fall apart over a man who is never going to choose me in the daylight." Minho stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze, close enough that she could see the exhaustion and fear and something achingly sincere warring in his expression. "I have run an empire for 6 years without ever once being afraid," he said. "I was afraid this morning. Not of the Becks. Not of losing territory or men or power. I was afraid of walking into that house and finding you actually gone. That fear taught me more about what I want than 6 years of running anything ever did." Zuri's resolve wavered, tears slipping free despite her best efforts to hold them back. "You don't know what you're asking for," she whispered. "I have a past, Minho. A daughter whose father wanted nothing to do with either of us. A life I ran from because I couldn't survive it anymore. I am not the kind of woman men like you build a future with. Then let me be the man who proves every assumption you've made about men like me wrong," he said, reaching for her hands, holding them like something precious. "I am not asking you to be convenient. I am asking you to be mine, you and Amara, exactly as you are, exactly as you've always been." She broke then, finally, sobbing into his chest as he held her steady, one hand cradling the back of her head like she was something worth protecting from the whole world. "Amara, roused by the sound, crawled over from her makeshift playmat and gripped Minho's pant leg, babbling happily, as if she too had missed him despite knowing him only a matter of weeks. Minho scooped her up in one arm, keeping Zuri pulled close with the other, and for the first time since the gunfire and the fear and the running, all three of them stood together in something that finally felt like safety. That evening, they returned to the estate together, and word spread through the staff quarters like wildfire. The maid was back, and this time, no one whispered warnings behind her back. Mrs. Yoon simply smiled knowingly and set an extra place at the family table without being asked. But peace, in Minho's world, was never permanent, and it wouldn't stay unchallenged for long. A week later, a scandal broke across underworld circles. Someone had leaked photographs of Zuri to a rival tabloid connected to the Beck family, twisting her past into a manufactured story, painting her as a gold-digging opportunist who had schemed her way into Kang Minho's bed to secure his empire for herself and her child. The article spread fast, designed to humiliate her publicly and pressure Minho into severing ties before his own allies began questioning his judgment. Zuri read it alone in the garden, hands shaking, old wounds tearing open in front of a headline that stripped away every ounce of dignity she'd fought to rebuild. She found Minho in his study, article clenched in her fist, ready to offer to leave quietly before she cost him everything he'd built. Instead, she found him already on the phone, voice sharper and colder than she'd ever heard it, dismantling the tabloid's parent company piece by piece in real time, pulling advertising contracts, threatening lawsuits, exposing the editor's own hidden ties to the Beck syndicate to every legitimate news outlet in the city. By morning, the article had been retracted, the editor fired, and a formal apology issued, though Minho's fury hadn't cooled by even a single degree. "You didn't have to do all that," Zuri said quietly that night, watching him finally set the phone down for the first time in hours. "I would burn this entire city to the ground before I let anyone make you feel small again," he said, and there was no exaggeration in his voice, only cold, absolute certainty. "You are not something for them to use against me. You are the reason I remember what I'm protecting in the first place." A few days later, the Beck family escalated further, attempting to sabotage a major shipment at Minho's primary export warehouse, hoping to cripple his finances and force a confrontation on their terms rather than his. Minho anticipated the move 3 steps ahead, having positioned loyal men inside the warehouse for exactly this contingency, and the sabotage attempt collapsed into an ambush that decimated the Beck family's operational muscle in a single decisive night. The message was unmistakable. Attacking Kang Minho's business was survivable. Attacking what belonged to him, his family, his woman, his daughter, was not. By the end of that week, the Beck patriarch requested an emergency meeting, arriving with an offer of peace, territory concessions, and a formal apology delivered in person, visibly shaken by how swiftly and completely his organization had been outmaneuvered. Minho accepted the terms with the same icy composure he brought to every negotiation, but everyone in that room understood the true cost of crossing him now extended far beyond mere territory. He had drawn a line no one would dare test again, and Zuri, watching from the doorway where she wasn't meant to be seen, finally understood the full weight of what it meant to be loved by a man like Kang Minho. That night, with the danger finally settled and the city quiet again, Minho found Zuri on the terrace overlooking Seoul's skyline, Amara asleep in her arms. He came to stand beside her without a word, watching the lights flicker across the horizon, before reaching into his jacket pocket with hands that, for the first time in 6 years, weren't entirely steady. "I've fought wars," he said quietly. "I've stared down men who wanted me dead and never felt my pulse change. But asking you this feels like the most dangerous thing I've ever done." He knelt slowly, careful not to wake the sleeping baby between them, and opened the small box to reveal a ring simple enough to be worn every day, chosen with more thought than any deal he'd ever brokered. "Marry me, Zuri. Not because I need an heir, not because it's convenient, but because I cannot imagine another sunrise where you and Amara aren't already mine to protect. Let me build the rest of my life around the two of you." Zuri's tears fell freely this time. No fear behind them at all, only overwhelming certainty. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Minho, yes." 3 months later, the wedding took place in the estate's garden, transformed for one evening into something soft and warm rather than fortified and guarded, filled with lantern light and quiet music and the faces of people who had watched their impossible love story unfold from the shadows. Mrs. Yoon cried through the entire ceremony. Amara, dressed in a tiny white gown, sat on her new father's hip throughout the vows, occasionally reaching up to pat his cheek the exact same way she had the very first day she'd crawled onto his sleeping chest and changed both their lives forever. Minho, feared by half a city, respected by the other half, stood at that altar and looked at Zuri like she had personally hung every star above them, and when he finally kissed his bride, every hardened man in that garden, men who had killed without blinking, found themselves blinking back unexpected tears. 6 months later, Zuri sat curled against Minho on the same terrace where he'd proposed, one hand resting gently over the small swell just beginning to show beneath her dress, Amara now toddling unsteadily across the terrace tiles nearby, chasing after a cat that clearly wanted nothing to do with her. Minho pressed a kiss to Zuri's temple, then lower, resting his palm over hers against the new life growing beneath it. "Another one to spoil," he murmured, and for the first time in his life, the word empire meant something entirely different to Kong Minho. Not territory, not power, not fear, but this, a wife who had walked into his life through impossible circumstance, a daughter who had thawed a heart no one believed could soften, and a future no rival, no danger, no scandal would ever again be powerful enough to take from him. The city below them stayed loud and dangerous and unforgiving, the same as it had always been. But on that terrace, in that family, love had already won the only war that ever truly mattered.